Okay, today is May 18, 2010. Today is May 18, 2010. We're at Virginia Wampler's house here. I'm sorry, Baker Wampler, and Blaine, Washington. And today we have with us Renee Coe doing the camera work. I'm Shannon Thompson, and we've got Don Meikle. He and Virginia are going to talk primarily about how they met as young kids and their lives growing up in Point Roberts, and in particular Virginia's family and how Don was involved with her family and just their great friendship through all these years. So Virginia has her first book of Point Roberts, which includes her early ancestors, and they'll be going through that and also just recounting stories in general. Okay.
Wow, this sounds really exciting.
Yes, it does.
Are we going to start when we arrived at the beach? No.
Yes, yes.
All right, well, we arrived at Boundary Bay before I was born. Dad rented a cottage down at the beach, and in the mid-30s, he happened to be walking along the private road and found that there was a cottage for sale, and he bought it. And that would have been about 1935 or 36, and it was shortly after that I imposed myself on the Thompson family. I imposed myself on just about everybody down there. And Virginia's grandfather, Yeppie Thompson, was one of a kind. He treated everybody, and particularly kids, like they were adults. He welcomed them, and he always was very generous. And if we would help gather firewood, as soon as he brought the crabs in, because he was a crab fisherman, if we helped gather up the firewood, which there was a lot on the beach, and get the fire going, then we would all share in the first cooked crabs. And I have very fond memories of Yeppie, even though I only knew him for, I guess, 2 years. Because he would take me and plunk me down in the bow of his skiff, which would be about a 16-foot wooden, 14 to 16-foot wooden skiff, heavy as all get out, and I would sit up in the bow while he rowed out past the boundary marker to lift the pots and empty the contents into the boat, and then turn around and row back in again, and then I would help. I thought I was helping, but probably getting in the way. Load the crabs into the pot to cook. And the interesting thing that I still remember was that the Baker family had a dog called Buster.
Buster.
And as soon as we left the beach, Buster would swim beside us, swim out with the boat to the pots, swim around the boat in circles while the pots were being loaded, and then return back to the beach. And a little bit of crab meat would be thrown in as a reward to Buster. And the other thing I remember is at the end of the year, in September, Yeppie would take his dinghy, the skiff that is, and haul it up in the woods at the end of the private road. And this was quite an undertaking, because this thing was a lumbering, heavy craft. No plywood was used in those days on boats. And he had to get it up well above the storm high water mark and then tie it to a big maple tree. And that was just south of where Janie has the encampment. And I always marveled at this, that he was comfortable enough to know that the storm wasn't going to get up there and attack his boat during winter. And one of the saddest days of my life was when he died. I was up pestering Yeppie's son-in-law, Lyle Culp, picking blackberries. And Lyle said, "I'm afraid you better go home." And I said, "Why, what did I do?" He says, "Nothing. It's just there's been some very sad news." And Yeppie had died. And it was the first time I'd run into death of a person I knew and was very fond of.
How old were you then?
I would only have been about 8. But it was a real shocker, you know. People didn't die that you knew. I mean, anybody who died, that was something we off in the distance, you know. But that was Yeppie. And then after that, of course, I got involved with Yeppie's widow, Anna Thompson. And she hired me for 10% to deliver fresh vegetables and milk up and down the beach to the campers. And of course, as a result, I got to know all of the Bakers, the Thompsons, the Culps, and cluttered up most of their lives during summers, and not just summers. We came down with quite a few weekends too, and we used to go roller skating together. Yeah. But the farm. Remember the honey house?
Oh, yes.
Where you could.
And the granary.
Yeah.
And the barn.
What was the honey house?
That's where the bees were
Bees.
kept, and the honey hives, and they harvested the honey from the bees, and it was elevated on posts off the ground so that rodents couldn't get in.
Right, the trays.
Yeah, that's right.
And that would have been on top of the beach. It would have been above the private
Yes.
road.
In the final Thompson house, there were 3 Thompson houses.
This is the first.
On page 14.
That's on the beach.
This was the second. We
On-
called the old house.
On page 6.
And this is a new house in progress.
Okay.
Here's the very large garden that Donnie also helped Grandma with by cleaning, picking, everything. Grandma often said how blessed she was with that little Meikle kid.
And he was only out for the money, the 10%?
Oh yeah, 10%.
Oh no, oh no. I know the love that he gave Grandma, and Grandma loved him just like that he was born to her.
But what always impressed me was that the only revenue after Yeppie died, because was from water sales, because the Thompsons controlled the drinking water supply to a lot of the private roads at the south end.
Right.
And Yeppie had kept this up, and on his death, then Harry and Lyle and Art would maintain it, which was always a chore, because things got a lot colder in the winters then, and they'd freeze the pipes, and these campers would insist that since they were paying $20 a year or something like that,
15.
$15 a year, the water better be there.
So, going back to the houses, so I'm not exactly 100% sure where the houses were. So where they're on Boundary Bay, above...
Private road,
Yep.
where Virginia's trailer is now, right next door, with Higgins' house.
So you go down the private road all the way, almost to the end.
No, where Virginia's trailer is, which is halfway.
Which is about halfway, and right now, was that near one of the houses that recently burnt?
That house did burn down.
Okay.
That was Higgins.
Okay.
And it's now been replaced. It's
Okay.
immediately adjacent to Higgins, where Virginia's trailer is. That's where the house
Okay.
was. And it
Okay.
was built, what, about 1905, 1904?
Which one?
The one on the beach.
Oh, 1902.
1902, yeah.
1902. And then the lumber was logs from the beach, which were hauled by rowboat probably around the bend to South Beach to the Largo, called the Logging Company and Sawmill. They cut up the planks for Grandpa's and Grandma's home. And Grandpa built that first home. Where was it?
It's back
I
here.
think it was on 12 or 14 maybe.
Oh, I thought it was... Anyway, we've got some really good pictures of it. No, that's the
Try-
main house on 12. Huh. That's the second one there.
16 maybe. No?
No. And there it is.
Oh, 14.
And you see the power lines coming down from the hill. This was where Higgins are right now. I'm right here. They had built a trail, like at the Hogarth curve, right up to the top of the hill, and that's where the two other houses were built, with the back about 1,000, 1,500 feet from the
Yeah.
hillside.
Yeah.
Is that where Elizabeth is?
Yeah.
Are they the homes up on Elizabeth? That's where your farm was, up,
No,
up
no,
on top?
where, what's his name?
Just want to get a Pat Grubb's house is, up,
Yeah.
up there. So that's where the Thompson
That's
farm.
where the second and third houses were
Okay,
built.
up on the
But
top.
the first house was right on the beach, and that's it there.
Okay,
Okay.
And of
Yeah.
course, it got modified and changed and rearranged. And after, I think the first owner after the Thompsons left was the McEwen's family.
Yes.
Yeah, there were two McEwen doctors, and one of them had bought the Thompson house, and then his brother bought the house right next door on the beach. And they were Westminster general practitioners. But, and after it disappeared, or was taken over, there was another cabin on this side, and it was where Virginia's trailer is for years, and it was just a small shack. And that's where they stored the oars and things for the boat. And when Yeppie was doing all the crab, and Anna after him, that's where they used their headquarters. Because they used to get the flat deck truck and then go up to the Burns and say, we'd like some paper. Because they always had big rolls of paper for wrapping groceries in the grocery store. And so we'd get paper, lay it on the back of the deck of the truck, and then set the crabs out with the prices of each crab.
Very intricately.
Yes,
And so this is what Yeppie did too.
yeah.
this is after they're boiled.
Yes, they're cooked crabs.
So there weren't no crabs walking off.
No,
With your money.
and they sold from 15 cents to, I think the biggest one was about 45 or 50.
Wow.
I can't remember that. I know they're very cheap compared
Yeah.
to now.
And
At
s-
$5.98 a pound
Ooh.
with innards and shell.
And so Yeppie was known for his crabs
Yeah,
and
it was-
his crab pot.
His part of the bay was called Crabtown, and he not only sold them to the campers and the visitors on weekends, but he also originally hauled them into Vancouver, or sold them to the buyers who took them by boat to Bellingham. But his, and the crab season wasn't like it is today. It was virtually all summer long. And they never bothered fishing crabs in the winter, because, you know, and the crab pots were interesting too, because they were big and square and heavy as all get out.
There's Grandpa by the crab table.
Yeah, that's right.
But he,
On page 40.
Yeah.
and Grandpa and Grandpa Thompson after the children were born. One of the most handsome men around until my daddy came. I think I have one up the tar pit too, but and the second house, third house, first on the beach, then the old house behind, built the new state-of-the-art house in 1912. It's a sister to the house Johnny lives in, but built by the same person. And that's where Mr. Grube lives up above. It's not sitting on the exact location, but it's very close because the prune tree is, about half of the orchard is still there, and it's just a glorious sight to go down there and look and see that orchard, because that's where we grew up.
Oh yeah, we went down. You remember the first time I took you down, and you could see where the well was,
Yeah.
and you could, because the well, when you came out the door, the back door, the path took you right to the woodshed with the well, and Grub is just slightly north.
Yeah.
But those walnut trees, one or two of them are still there.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, that was, and then immediately north was the Andrew Thompson farm,
Yes,
and it is now Elizabeth Palisades.
and Mads.
And then immediately north of Andrew was Mads,
Yes,
which is,
above you.
yeah, that's owned by
Meikle Homestead.
Monroe family, yeah.
Is that those really small parcels of
Well,
land?
yeah.
No.
Actually, Andrews came right over to the end of Johnson Road.
Okay.
Okay, and Mads just had a section, a small, well, a fairly good lot, probably an acre and a half, immediately north, and that's where the tennis court with where Monroe is.
In the greenhouse?
Yeah,
Okay. Right
That's-
at the intersection of Goodman
yeah,
and,
to the
yeah,
left.
just north
And,
of that.
the, and then Andrew and Mads left Point Roberts and moved to
Custer.
Custer, yes.
And I have a picture there. They started liver and horse business.
Livery?
Livery,
On page 16, that picture? And that's the one
And-
that's in Custer?
yes, and these people are, I can't see,
All listed?
yep, Auntie Dora, I'm sure, is in this. After building that home on the beach, Grandma and Grandpa, they left Denmark in 2000, the late 2001. Grandma was
1901.
yes. My grandma was pregnant with Auntie Dora. She was born in that little house down on the beach.
Oh,
And the reason they put up the fence around it was to keep her in out of the tide, which came right up to the fence.
There were no
wow.
breakwaters until 1934.
No, and I have that in here too, how Grandpa was hired, or that was part of the condition when they bought lots from him along the beach. And they, I don't know specifically what price was made on it, but the road Grandpa did and the breakwater, which were thick planks and pilings. And only one person on that whole private road defaulted and did not pay, but he still had the breakwater.
Are you going to name names?
No.
Okay.
Well, his grandson still is
Yes,
there today.
and his grandson is a very nice person.
Yeah.
The father was too, but he was one of these
Oh, he was a character.
brimstone and fire.
Fire and brimstone.
He was a,
Will you name names?
sure, he was an Anglican priest.
Priest?
Yeah, from London, England.
Oh,
And he married a very, very intelligent lady who had been educated in Switzerland.
and dressed to the T.
And she
Always
was
hats.
a heroine because she would take and gather all the kids around her at the beach and read to them, read poetry and read children's stories. And she kept Reverend under control, or as much control as possible. And
He needed it.
and she, yeah, that's she got injured, barnacle, and developed blood poisoning and died.
Oh.
And her daughter did too, from Boundary Bay.
Oh.
And it was really sad because actually I think that she had been fairly well off and had kept her husband and everybody. But their house was originally owned by Dr. Walmsley,
Oh,
and Dr. Walmsley owned quite a chunk. He bought a lot from, quite a bit of property, 3 or 4 lots from your grandfather. Because what happened, this is supposed to be Virginia talking, not me.
no.
Yeppie Thompson had all of the property from the section line where the Mitten trailer is, south, and his brother-in-law, Hanson, who was H.B. Hanson, which is by coincidence same as that contractor, he had everything north to Garth Road. And they subdivided it into lots and sold them off to the campers. Virtually, I would say 80% of the people who bought from Yeppie were medical doctors from Westminster. That's why it was nicknamed Pill Alley, or Doctor's Row. And Dr. Woodley owned the lots, the north side of Yeppie's subdivision.
I think this is the plot, how it was laid out.
Yeah,
On page 28.
yeah. I can't see the dimensions, but
The date was 1911.
yeah, because he didn't get title. I found his title until 1910. Yep.
Who didn't? Yep,
Oh.
he didn't?
No, I have the copy of the certificate from the land office in,
I have those too,
Yeah,
but
it
I
was-
thought it was 1908.
well, I thought it was 1910. You want to fight
1908
about
when he got
it?
oh, arm wrestle anytime. 1908 he got his citizenship.
Yes,
Right.
but in 1910, the registrar gave him, signed over 40 acres. And it was, I forget the price, but it wasn't much.
$14.96.
Something like that.
Yeah, you need to put a couple zeros after that now per inch.
I'll give you 15.
Anyway, where were we?
Well, let's
The
go
lots, Pill Alley on the one
South
side,
side.
and Hanson who
HP.
bought.
Yeah, and Hanson was, what was her name?
Nathalia,
Nathalia was Yeppie's sister, and married to H.B. Hanson. And Nathalia, I'd never met her, of course, but she had a reputation of being a rather aggressive and
big woman,
large lady.
and Grandpa was so little.
And the blue house across from the post office was Hanson's new house.
Oh,
Okay.
so
He
they
had-
moved from the
No,
beautiful
they
beach.
They were on the beach further along.
Uh-huh.
Then they moved, but that house wasn't where it is now. It was closer to the marina.
Okay.
It got moved.
And because the tide came in during the storms,
Oh,
I think that wasn't until the big storm, was it?
When it truly flooded.
Yeah,
Yeah.
about when would that have
in
been?
the 30s. Yeah.
Yes.
Mrs. Hanson decided she was too close to the water, so would you move the house up to Gulf Road? So they put it on
Roll it.
This
poles
is
and rolled it up.
Nathalia. Grandpa's sister here.
On page 20.
Yeah.
Now, I think I have a picture of the house. The part of their home, I remember, was pathway to the house was raised cement about this high off the ground, and you could fall this way or that way if you didn't be careful. And there were some Icelanders that were heavy drinkers and had some falls.
Had little trouble maneuvering.
But none of the Danish people.
This is what beautiful grandma. That's about how she looked when Donnie was her right hand.
On page 27.
No, that was before it was when you worked before that. That's at 83. But look at that beautiful smile.
Yeah.
She was quite.
She
So-
was always so welcoming.
Is that what, I mean, was their kindness what drew you in, or were you just,
A busybody.
yeah.
Yeah.
No.
And welcome. No, they were very welcoming, and I really was very, and she was so enthusiastic and happy, but industrious. You know, she didn't believe that people should sit around twiddling their thumbs.
And she saw the value in Donnie. There wasn't anything he couldn't do. There was 2 or 3 long chicken houses. He even would bring the chickens in the wire basket, the eggs in the wire baskets. There wasn't much that he didn't do for Grandma. Plug chickens, delivered fruits and vegetables and flowers. I don't think he delivered flowers
No.
much.
No, I didn't have anything to do with flowers, but I did have a lot to do with milk.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
what you had to do, you had to take the milk from the barn and take it down and put it through the
Separate.
separator, and
And
then
that was in the old second house they built.
the second house actually became a brooder house and a woodshed, and encompassed the well, the whole thing. It was still there when Grubbs bought, because they stayed in it while they were having their
Did
house
they?
built. Yeah,
I liked that house.
yeah, so did I.
Nice
And it
layout.
had these wonderful hardwood brooder hatching boxes for raising chicks. You know, you put the fertilized eggs in, and then you turn the thing on, and
Did you turn eggs once a day for her?
yes, and I also sat with a brush candling them, cleaning them too, as I recall. And if I wasn't thorough, I got rejects. Yes.
What about
Well,
your,
how did she get you to do all of this?
Well,
I mean, it
because I
wasn't
was
just
really
the money.
I was
Very
really enthused.
industrious.
I was really enthused about it, and she was good friends. We were all, and
They were family to Grandma.
Virginia's brother Johnny, who had a wonderful personality, attracted friendship and was mutually supportive. And so he taught me to drive, and I think he was, what, a year older than I was?
In the cow
Maybe
field.
2. And we would get, I started driving, I think, when I was 10.
Damn.
And we would get, the only truck that was available that time in the early 40s belonged to Len and Ella. But it was more or less taken over as the family truck for trucking purposes. So we would get and cut the hay, and then we'd stack the hay,
Shook.
shooks,
Shooks.
yes, and then we'd get the truck and load it on the hay on the truck and take it over and put it in the loft in the barn, and
Tell them how you got it up the loft to put it in the barn by rope, wasn't it?
that's right. And I never forget, Johnny always, he reminded me a lot of my brother Jim. When there was a chore, Johnny always came up with clean hands. And
I wanted to ask what your other brothers,
he did the same thing.
Were you the only industrious one?
No, my younger brother, he got it dirtier than I did. But we'd unloaded the hay. And right outside the barn was the watering trough for the cows. And of course there was a lot of cow manure around, and we got stuck in the manure. So Johnny said to me, well, I'll drive, you push.
I figures. Splunk.
Went swimming very quickly after that, as we got the truck out with the wheels spinning, and I just got
The cow trough never looked better.
And the other time, and in those days, people didn't always dehorn cows.
Yeah.
And there was a lovely tap for drinking water right at the trough. And I remember once I was leaning under to get a drink, and I got butted by this cow in the backside, and I ended up in the trough.
Grandma had disciplined cows. This is a picture of Grandpa's crab pots on the beach.
Yes.
On page 34, do you still have the crab pots, or
Oh,
did they
don't
just
think
fall
there's
apart?
any.
No, I don't
left.
think that. The only ones I've got left are the round ones. These are all square, and they had to be dipped because the webbing that was used for the tunnels was cotton, and it didn't last very long. And so you had to dip them in tar, which was a dirty job. You had a big tar pot, and you get that boiling, and it was wrapped with chicken wire, and you dipped them in. There was none of this stainless steel like you have today.
And then he would cook the crabs right on the beach
Yeah, in a big tub.
in a big tub.
Large one. He'd tar the tubs, or the traps on top of the hill
Right.
most of the
Well, it
time.
was done in the off season.
Yes.
Yeah. But,
You know the reason for tarring?
Besides what he just said,
What did you say?
preserving the
Yes.
cotton, because in those days you didn't have any nylon. It was all cotton, and if you were lucky to get one season out of it with all of the sea activity.
even with tarring.
No, with tarring you get a full season, but at the end of the year you'd end up doing them again for the next year. And the tunnels were tricky because they would go in at an angle, and you had to make them taut and affix them tightly so that the crabs couldn't. Because crabs are pretty ingenious.
Out that big a hole
Yeah.
and a tunnel, like,
Right. But you know, I tell people they never use bait in those days, and they think I'm crazy. But we never put,
No.
nobody ever
No.
had to bait
I don't
traps.
think anything that was of any value to eat would go to the humans, not to the crab pots.
That's right. They never baited crab pots, and you go out and you get a dozen, 15 crabs in one pot. There were so many of them. And then the first trick, before they started using bait, was they would take a lid from a can, like a soup can, and suspend it in the pot, and the reflection
Oh, I
attracted
like that.
the crabs. But Yuppie never had to do any of that. He just dropped the pots, and the curious crabs would start going in, and then they'd chase each other in and couldn't get out.
But the crabs, there's not that many crabs left.
There are
Like
a lot
that.
more. There are a lot more crab fishermen now.
Oh,
Right.
true.
Depleting.
I can't believe that the crab population is still survives as well as it does. But
With the immigration, the Orientals are very seafood conscious, and the Blaine crab fishermen would lay their pots just right next to the marker in the meander line. Here's America, here's Canada, and they'd come swooping in very fast boats. That's recent, not in the olden days, and strip the crab pots and back to market. You had to be very alert. You have to be now, but they've had so many fines. I don't know if we said in that little cabin on the beach that Grandpa built, Auntie Dora was born in 10/12/202. Mother was the next one, born in 1904 in the same place. Harry had the honor of being born in the old house up on top of the hill. And then I think it's two and 4 years later came Auntie Ella and Uncle Arthur.
But when Yeppie first came, as I recall, he started to work in the cannery. And that's how he got his first job. As most of the people on Point Roberts did, either directly or indirectly.
The APA or the George and Barker?
No, APA.
Okay.
Wasn't he an APA? Harry wasn't. Yeppie was APA cannery, yeah.
Yes.
Harry, I know he worked in George and Barker.
Yeah.
But
On that talk.
yeah. And then Harry and Len, they went north for several years into Alaska fishery every year. And Ella and Len's wife and Margaret, who was Harry's wife, they were left to look after the homestead and their homesteads. And they had their hand full because they were sort of grass widows for 2 or 3 months, looking after the kids and growing. They all had their own special gardens. Ella had one of the best strawberry crops that ever existed in Point Roberts. The whole front, well, it's still, that yard is still there.
Yes.
And that whole thing was just strawberry plants. It was wonderful to go up and help her pick strawberries.
They were pretty much all enterprising, especially the girls of Grandma and Grandpa's family. Len, Ella's husband, worked on the traps and made good money for that time of the century. But one of the storms of the century came in real strong to Boundary Bay, and Len and his partner, who was working for Alaska Backers, had to strap themselves to the piling to survive. And my Auntie Ella was expecting, and she was in the bedroom window of the newer home at Point Roberts and had their little glasses on them.
And she
And
watched the
watching
whole thing happen.
Wow.
So how did her baby come out okay?
Come out fine.
Okay, good.
Screaming, I'm sure.
So that's on page, some of these pictures are on page 42, and then there's some things that are written on page 43.
Is their birth dates, and Grandpa gave each daughter or son, I think it's 10, isn't it? It's in here.
5 or 7 acres. Yeah. Around out of the 40-acre homestead.
So he ended up with 109 acres by the time he quit by. And so when each daughter and son got married, they received this. And so it was our neighborhood. And I'll tell you, it was the most fun-loving neighborhood. There was some spits and spats, but it all ended up good. It was a wonderful neighborhood to grow up in.
And was it a wonderful neighborhood to visit too, Don?
Yes.
Donnie was very enterprising. His younger brother Charlie didn't stop at the Thompson compound. He was over at Largo's in the sawmill and even in the reef nets. And Jimmy was on our side, his brother Jimmy. And I don't think Tommy worked, did he, for them?
No. No, Tom got quickly discouraged. He worked for Ellis Johnson Logging, and he'd been on the job 2 days, and Ellis somehow managed to drop a saw, and it ripped Tom's shoulder open, and he ended up in the hospital. And so that ended his logging career. But then he got into the chicken business with Bunny too,
Yes,
because
yes.
when Mrs. Burns' husband died and she had to sell off the chickens, Tom and I went up and crated all of the, sexed and crated all of the chickens and shipped them out, and we ended up with 28 feral cats living on that property.
Where was that property?
That's-
What is it today? Leghorn Heights?
That's Leghorn
Okay.
Heights, yeah. But, and then Tom worked for Eggert in the store.
That's right.
Yeah.
The
And,
story. He was more the businessman.
but brother Jim, whose girlfriend was Phyllis Culp, he delivered milk as well.
Right.
Yes.
There's pictures, a picture in here somewhere of Jimmy and Phyllis with the milk
Okay. The milk buckets?
going down the hill.
No, we put the milk, you had to bottle it. After you went through the separator and you bottled and put the cap on, the Sunrise Farm written on top.
I
And
have some of those too.
then they always kept flour sacks, and you could get 4 bottles in a flour sack over your shoulder. And the trail came down on an angle from the top, right behind Virginia's trailer, and so you walked down there and delivered, and you sometimes had to make 2 or 3 trips,
Right.
Yes.
you know, if at the height of the summer, because there were no refrigerators. People did have ice boxes.
Yeah.
The Garvin Ice and Fuel Company delivered ice to all the cottages, and you know, well, our family alone would go through half a dozen quarts of milk a day, and so this was augmenting that, and all the vegetables that could be produced were sold. But the interesting thing about this was the economics of Mrs. Thompson to survive year in and year out
20 years.
came from, by this time, most of the land, the lots had been sold, so there wasn't that income. But it came from the revenue for water, selling the produce and the milk, and walnuts.
And chickens.
And then the
I
egg.
don't know if they sold honey.
No, they didn't. No, because after Yippee died, the honey thing was over. But that's right. You separated and the cream went into a container, and it was shipped to Bellingham. And so were the eggs. They were crated in 12 dozen. Wasn't it a gross?
I can't remember.
12 dozen crate.
How did they get shipped to Bellingham?
Point Roberts Auto Freight. Prior to that, they would go by the boat up until
Tulip.
1936, 35, when the Tulip stopped running.
And when did Point Roberts Auto Freight start?
As soon as the Tulip stopped running,
Really?
1936. And it
Wow.
was founded by my wife's uncle. And he ran it until the war, and then he joined the Navy. And then his brother, who wasn't able to, the military wouldn't have anything to do with him, he ran it. And then a fellow named Wolf, Curly Wolf from Bellingham, took it over from Wally. And I have a history of the Point Roberts Auto Freight. Up until these new guys got on, I've got to find out who they are.
So there was no market when you were growing up? No, like everybody, you bought things from other families.
That's right.
There wasn't a marketplace,
But
there wasn't a
was Ben's
store.
store that had,
But prior to Ben's store, like when did Ben's
no.
store?
No, even with Ben's store, they didn't have much in the way of produce.
no, oh, none.
No.
No, that was,
Eggert Burns, when he started the Maples, or at least his sister, they'd brought in watermelon and melons and a few fruit, a few vegetables, but people grew their own.
So you said started the Maples, that was the first store, or?
No, that was the, Whalen's was the first store in Boundary Bay.
Okay.
And then,
Emma Ludwigson.
eh?
Emma Ludwigson.
Yeah, Emma Ludwigson, who was Egbert Burns' sister. They started the first store. Actually, it was a more of a cafe, the first one, then it burned down. And then the Maples was built.
So the Whalen's is still now what we know is
The
the
Whalen's
Whalen's,
store.
where the cafe had
The
been,
one right next to it was Waters, which was a dance hall,
which is north or south?
south,
Okay.
okay? And then the one south of that was the Maples.
Where Clark's is?
Yeah,
Or was?
Yeah, Clark's,
Was the
Maples
Maples.
became the Clark store.
Okay.
And, but Burns, in the late 30s and early 40s, he did have some produce, but it was difficult, you know, because you brought it in by truck and it would sit out in the sunshine, and after one day you'd throw the lettuce away, or you'd keep making those big head of lettuce would shrink to. I know, I worked for him in the 40s.
What year did Ben's store open up? As I remember Ben's store.
In the 20s,
In the 20s?
yeah.
And they
Ben's
sold
store, which was on,
which is USA gas
Gas
station
which is
now.
Tyee and Gulf.
Yeah, but Boundary Bay had, actually, it had, on the Canadian side, about a half a block from the border, was Chudley's store. Right on the border was Metcalf's store, and it was largely groceries, but no fresh fruit and vegetables, plus a couple of slot machines. Then it expanded into a dance hall where your racket club is, and that was a fish and chip joint and a dance hall.
Best fish and chips.
And that's
Yeah.
really just right over the border.
Right on
Literally.
the border.
Yeah.
And it was all accessible both sides. I mean, there was no fence or anything.
No.
Everybody shopped, just went into Metcalf's, and the people on that side walked across and picked up whatever they needed. And the only thing, if you were bringing anything that was like cigarettes or any of that sort of thing, you were not supposed to walk through. You had to go up and tell the officer on duty, and he'd confiscate your cigarettes or your cigarette papers or your tobacco. But
And that's where the where it is currently that the Woodbeat
that's right.
George.
That was the lower
yeah.
customs.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Americans didn't have anybody there for years, and then one year they decided it was time that they should do something about this, so they put a trailer.
Tent.
Well, no, that was earlier. That was up the hill.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you're down in California.
I'm talking in Boundary Bay. Up the hill, yeah. The first American Customs Office was a pup tent.
Gee, how things have changed.
Pretty big pup tent now. But what people, and anyway, we had Metcalf's. The roller rink had a cafe, fish and chips and sandwiches. And then there was Whalen's. And then there was one that after Waters had burned down in 36, and about 39, Egbert Burns of Maples fame bought the lot from Waters, much to the chagrin of the Whalen family, and he built what was called the No Dice, and it was called White Spot. They kept changing the name, and it was a dance hall, but it didn't work as a dance hall, so they just filled it with slot machines and fish and chip. And then the Maples had a fountain with ice cream and sandwiches and that sort of thing. So there's lots of places to buy groceries and eat, because, you know, there were thousands of people came down on weekends. You couldn't move. It was like Coney Island. On Sundays, people, you know, it was...
So how did Ben's store figure into all of that? I mean,
It was the only year-round store.
okay.
Everything else was seasonal.
And that, you said, started in about 1920-ish?
24 4/26, I can't tell you off the top
I
of my
think it
head.
was after I was born, 26 maybe, 27. And he not only had groceries and a little bit of hardware and stuff, he had a charge program going. And they'd come in and get what they wanted, and then he would add it up and they'd come in and pay for it. Well, consequently, a lot of people weren't able to pay come what was it called? 1932.
The Depression?
Depression. But actually, I don't think that was a true answer because I don't think Point Roberts noticed the Depression. We had the farms, we had the sea, we had the fruit trees, and what more could you want? The farm animals as well as the vegetables. But there were some people that didn't do this. Some families never had a vegetable garden.
How did they get by? What did they do?
Well, it was seasonal. It was always feast and famine. And this is why, and Ben Thorderson, who also had a bit of a problem with Johnny alcohol, but he became the banker in effect, and he would carry people year in and year out. But the women, the wives, when their husbands got their season's check from the cannery, they would insist that they go down and pay off Ben's bill. And of course, this was always a big occasion because dear old Ben, you'd go in and pay off the annual account, and there would be a box of chocolates or candy to go home to celebrate that your credit was
Nice.
now reestablished. And this was always a big event. But I think even when after Carl was out of the store, when he sold the store, there was still some of those accounts outstanding.
Yes.
Because I think when Lisa and that group bought the place, I think they ended up with those accounts
Oh,
and just had virtually threw them all away because there was, by this time, there was no way that, and you know, you run up a bill of $1,500, $2,000, that's a whole year's income.
Right.
A lot more than a year's income for a lot of people in those days. And Ben carried it. I don't know what kind of a relationship he had with his bank manager, but and I can understand why he had a little trouble with drinking because if you had all of that, and these were, I mean, I can still see the box of account
yes. Oh,
books.
yes. I can still see Carl Julius's books.
Yeah.
Of,
Well, Carl, when he bought the business,
he inherited,
he
and then did somebody inherit Carl's?
I'm pretty sure Lisa could tell you, but
Yeah,
I'm pretty
I'll
sure
ask her.
that she had still some of those
Old accounts.
and they all had charge system. Only most people were expected to pay within 30 days.
Yes.
But none of these fishermen
Could
had
carry
the money,
till the season
you know,
started.
until the end of the season. But the income for a reef netter, if he had a good season, might hit $800 for a year's work. And I can remember Lloyd Allen and Ed Menzies, and if you'd say, well, was it a good year? Oh yeah, ended up with $750 this year, and that's would virtually be their income for the year, and the rest of their, stuff was earned from their food was from their gardens and from their friends and their neighbors.
Ben's was strictly Point Roberts.
Right.
Carl's was a lot of the summer campers for building supplies and nuts and bolts and all that, as well as some locals, and Arnie Myrtle was one of them. and he'd go month to month, paid exactly on the dot. And I, when Carl was away, I was doing the tallying and running it for him. And I sent out, I had Arnt Middle's bill done, and I sent it to him. And he come in the store, and he says, "Sister," and oh, I can still feel it. He says, "I've never bought a popsicle in my life." And this was about 3 items that I'd slipped from Jack Myrtle's onto Artie's. And oh boy, I can still feel that grip.
How old were you?
Arnie Myrtle that makes the spinning wheels.
But how old were you then?
Oh, I had 3 girls.
Oh,
by
okay.
then.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've forgotten.
I just wanted to make sure you weren't a traumatized teenager or
Oh
something.
no, he could virtually pick you up with that grip,
Yes.
and it wasn't done as it was
No,
an attention
no
getter.
threat.
You know, you pay attention, and I can still remember, boy, and he would just grab your shoulder, and you'd think he was going to lift you off the ground. Yeah, he was one of our favorite residents of Point Roberts.
I think if every person saw Arnie's basement with the hand tools that he made, even pressed iron and stuff like that, it was a sight to behold. And I don't know if the grandchildren come over and got it or what happened,
Well,
but it was the whole basement.
Lillian took most of it, but I'm not sure where it went from there.
It went to her, what Lillian got went to her son, I think, Don. And I've knocked in his door 3 times. No, he says, "If you will give me Grandpa's spinning wheel, I'll give you anything he asks for in his papers." So I won't give up my spinning wheel.
But you paid for your spinning wheel, didn't you?
Oh,
Because
yes.
I remember looking at one of your books and there's a
The
receipt.
Yes.
$10 or
Oh, yeah, I paid
$12.
for it, but
Yeah.
he never got one. And his mother did, but I don't know why Donnie, but there was a girl as well as 2 boys, so. But
That's
he
too
really,
bad, because there was one sold not too long ago.
really,
Yeah, it belonged to Pizzetti's, and it got, somebody's sold it.
oh,
And of course, we inherited one from
yes.
Professor Sage's
Sage,
family. But
Who's
we're wandering
Professor
away from
Sage?
it. Eh?
Who is Professor Sage?
Professor Sage owned the property on the west side, which would have been Tinkham's Grove.
Or Heidi
And,
Baxter's.
and next to the
places.
breakers.
Yeah, the first lot. You know, there's a big stretch of land
Yes.
south of the breakers.
Yes.
The first lot in there, property, it was an acre or 2. Anyway,
Probably
it
2.
belonged to the Alaska Packers Association. And Professor Sage, who taught at UBC, owned it, or leased it, rented it. He was a tenant of APA for years. And what was the name of the original farmer who was next door?
Farmer? Milligan? No.
Oh, they were up to him. Anyway, Professor Sage was a tenant, and when APA got into their financial problems and started selling off all of their property, he was front and center and was given the right to buy it, which he did. And then he subdivided it, and there's several owners. But he was a long-time, very good friend of Arnie Myrtle's. They corresponded, and Arnie looked after his place while he was in town. And his Sage's daughter, I better be careful here. No, I guess it would be Sage's granddaughter. She gave us a bunch of Professor Sage's letters and legal documents and stuff, and this spinning wheel.
Wasn't
She
that
thought-
from talking to Irene at the Arts and Music Fest?
She said that her daughter wasn't interested, and she didn't want. Lived in Ottawa, And so she thought it should rightfully stay with some organization on the point, because Arnie had made that for her, for Professor Sage's wife.
Yes.
So this is the land just south of the breakers where there's a large house now
Yeah.
with
No,
the tennis court.
further south.
Further south.
Yeah.
So closer to the yellow.
Closer to where Runa's little
Yeah,
place
it's,
is.
It's on this, it's where Heidi Baxter's property is, it's down along that.
So it's north of Lighthouse, just north of Lighthouse
Yeah.
Park.
Yes.
Okay.
the
where
most
the-
northerly section, and it wasn't, there was a farm there. And I can't, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name.
That's okay.
But it will come to me, probably. in
It
the
won't
middle
make
of
any
the night.
difference to us though.
It might be on that map.
Okay.
Thank you. It's behind.
Yeah, 'cause we have some wonderful pictures of it. And then Ben's and
This one?
Runa's,
Could be. Thank you.
There's another one too, in
I
plastic.
think it's the same.
Okay.
This might not be legible.
Ben and Runa's grandchildren own the lot right next door, and they still have it.
That was the prettiest place to go for the Point Robert sunsets.
Yeah,
Well, it's not very legible.
Oh, boy.
It'd be over here.
It's upside down.
It's upside down.
yeah, I can't,
So this is Roosevelt.
So it'd be right down.
no,
Yeah, that would be Lighthouse Park down in here.
Freeman's, I don't know Freeman's, but it's north of that. What's that one say?
are you on the west side?
Yes.
Yes. George and Barker owned that. Henry Williams don't own that.
Where's Gulf Road?
Right, Gulfer. Well, here's Roosevelt, so Gulf Road should be
Right here,
there.
I can't read it.
It's upside down, it should be.
In any event, we could dig that out.
Where were you pointing? In here?
So this is Roosevelt, or this is Gulf, right?
Oh.
And that's Alaska Packers right here.
And on that map, it may be Alaska Packers still.
And then here it says, I can't read the name on the first lot,
George and Barker.
but then the second one says Sarah Olson.
No,
and
we're
then
not in the right
August
place.
No.
Tiller.
Leave
Tyler?
it, leave it, Sharon. I've got it.
I'll look at it tonight.
Okay.
I haven't read it up to,
Any event, getting back to the Thompsons, quickly.
yes.
Andrew
Thank you.
Andrew and Mads, did they leave at the same time?
I'm not sure.
Because, you know, what did,
Did,
there was a degree of acrimony that developed.
Well, let's go back for a second before we get to that. Let's get to how did your family get to Point Roberts, Virginia?
I had that open to the page that opened, right? They came from the Isle of Fano, Denmark, on a ferry from the Isle of Fano to Esbjerg, where they booked passage on Canadian steamship and rail company, and this is their original receipt for their passage to the New World.
And that's on page 10. And how much did they pay?
Can you see it? $161.
$161.
And that would have been for how many people?
That was just Yuppie and
2.
his wife Anna.
And when they got to United States or Canada, they came Canadian Rail out. The passage was directly to Custer. And at that time, the railway ran through East Delta there. They had a platform,
Colebrook
Colebrook.
Station.
They had a station there, and that's where they got off. And the 2 that had come before, Grandpa Mads and Jack,
Yeah, Jack.
Andrew,
No, Andrew
Yeah,
came
Jack.
later.
met them with the big farm wagon and another wagon, and carried them to Point Roberts, and that's where they lived their married life and died.
So that they came to Point Roberts because his brothers were here,
Yeah.
or there?
They
Okay.
had written a letter back to Grandpa telling about the wonderful country it was, trees everywhere.
And there was work in the canning field. Because Jack, and we've kind of lost track of Jack. We don't know where he went.
Yeah, no,
But Mads and Jack were already here. Yuppie and Anna came, and then not that long after, a year or 2, I think, Andrew and the Hanson's wife again,
Nathalia.
Nathalia, the other 2 children arrived and stayed. But one of the unfortunate things about the Thompson holding was, Virginia will try and correct me on this, it ended up with a Canadian named Gunn lending money to Andrew. And Andrew didn't have the wherewithal to pay it back, so he signed over his property to Gunn. And Gunn had no use for it because he had all that other property right on the border. So he sold it to Whalen. That would be Pat Whalen Sr. And so we ended up then with the Whalens right in the middle of the Thompson enclave. And having these Catholic Irish invaders in the middle of a Danish Icelandic enclave, well, that just was not on, you know. And so
I'm sorry, and your heritage is?
mine,
Yeah, yours.
universal.
Isn't it like Scottish or something?
Oh yeah, but we get along with everybody.
Oh, you can say that again. Your mom and dad were.
See, I told you. Any event,
I guess you had to.
there was a degree, and Whalens were very confrontational with most people.
Especially Lila.
Well, Pat Sr., they weren't very imaginative because Pat Sr. was the founder of the Whalen Empire, and his son was Mike, and then Mike's son was Pat. So Pat Sr. Was a pile driver by trade. That's why he came to Point Roberts, because it was all kinds of work at the cannery and building wharves and docks
Traps.
and fish traps. Anyway, he ended up with that property. Well, he died, and Mike and Lila took it over. And Yuppie and Mads, to a lesser degree, because he didn't have that big a holding, really resented this Whalen invasion. And after Yuppie died, and I was there when this happened, Mike Whalen, who was a gentle, really nice guy, Lila's wife, he came up the Thompson Road one day with a freshly born calf and gave it to Mrs. Thompson and said, "Would you like a calf?" And of course she said, "Of course, you know." And it was a gesture of friendship to
settled.
try and calm things down. And after that, Virginia's father and Pat Whalen were on the water board together, and Pat had put a water tower in the lot just across the street from the Baker house. You remember?
I do.
Yes? Anyway,
Would that be on the west side of Boundary Bay, or
No, no.
just a little bit up
where
from
Elizabeth
Elizabeth?
Palisades, the far end of, well, actually, I
It
don't
was
think Elizabeth,
abutting our home lot,
that's right.
So right
Um,
on Elizabeth, right
yeah.
across the
Yeah.
street.
You see,
the north, the south end.
the piece that Andrew had was shaped in an odd configuration, and the Bakers, instead of looking at Thompson property, would look west to Whalen's invasion.
Yeah.
And this was a nice high point for a water tower, and he drilled a well, because of course the Bakers had a well, and where there's one well, you might get another one. Anyway.
And it might tap there first.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Anyway, Mike did his best to make friends with everybody, and he was a very gentle guy. And in the middle of Elizabeth Palisades, where Andrew Thompson's house was, Mike Whalen had a potato field, a fairly good sized one, and he was sneaking away from the duties of a husband at home and up there playing in his potato patch quite often. I used to go and help weed and listen to him tell me stories about when he came to Point Roberts and helped his father with the pile driving and whatnot. And they had an orchard, wonderful fruit trees that Andrew had planted. Johnny and I used to go in there and pick plums and
Plums.
yeah, those little beautiful peach plums and pears and apples. But anyway, that's how that original Thompson acreage got broken up.
Pick it up.
And
I thought I had that quit claim deed. I do have it, that when it all began, and I have it in here somewhere, and you explained that to me then, but I don't see it.
Well, we've been talking for about an hour, so why don't we take a break?
Yes.
And then
please.
Virginia can try to find it, and
I was going to put something on the table,
okay.
and then I'll look.
Good.
how good are you at editing?